Serviced accommodation and TOMS. Where are we now? Hi, I'm Kimberly Shapcott, qualified chartered accountant, property investor and entrepreneur. Let's sit down and have a chat. Serviced accommodation and VAT has been a very questionable topic for the last couple of years. And the reason for this is whether the TOMS scheme, the Tour Operator Margin Scheme, was available or should be used on serviced accommodation where it was rent to serviced accommodation. We've had a case going through the courts for the last couple of years, which is the Sonder Case. And on the 14th of January 2025, we got the news of what the upper tax tribunal's decision was on this position. So today we're going to dive into that of what has been said so you know exactly what you should and shouldn't be doing based on the information that we have to date. Something key to probably mention before we dive in is that they have until the 14th of February 2025 to put in an appeal, which means an appeal may or may not have been going in as we are speaking on this video, and we may have further updates later in the year. However, this is the current update, this is the position we are at today and where we should be placing ourselves. Let's start from the beginning of where this all came about, that the rent to serviced accommodation is being provided by Sonder. So the company itself is charging that at the margin under the TOMS scheme because basically it is taking in some accommodation, it is then selling that on to tourists, short-term lets basically, to individuals or businesses at a short hold license rather than any sort of long lease on the property. And in doing this, their argument was that they fall within the Tour Operators Margin Scheme, which is where you take some different services and then you resell them as a package to a short-term person. So on that basis, you can calculate your VAT based on the margin that you are receiving, which means you'd be charged VAT on the full amount. However, the VAT you pay to HMRC is based on the margin from the income you receive from the customer, the client, the holiday maker, against any of the direct costs of providing that, which would include things like rent, energy, all the different costs that you're incurring. And the margin on that, you would then pay VAT on that element, rather than pay VAT on the full balance that you have received. Their argument being that they fit within the criteria of the TOMS scheme, and the TOMS scheme is very much a scheme, if you tick the boxes and you are within the requirements, you have to operate the scheme. It's not a choice, it is a requirement. So based on that, they have determined that they fit the scheme, therefore they must apply the TOMS scheme. Now, this has gone through a few different tiers of tax tribunal, tax courts, to see whether this is the correct treatment. Now, we had the first tier where it was no, it is wrong. There was an appeal which took it to the next higher level court, which then overturned that and said no, the TOMS scheme definitely does apply. And now we've got to the next tier of court who have now reversed what the last tier said and have basically said no, the TOMS scheme does not apply. So let's dive into some of the details of what the appeal has gone through and the case where we sit now, so that you can understand whether you may or may not be able to apply the TOMS scheme, and depending on the position, what you may need to do. So let's have a look at the summary from the first tier tribunal. So as you'll see on screen, we can see that firstly it reaffirmed that services acquired by a travel business must directly benefit the end traveller. Now, they basically said in the Sonder case that this long-term lease obtained from a landlord were a bit too remote from an actual short-term accommodation, because you're going from, say, a 3-year lease or agreement to a weekend or a week or 2 weeks or whatever short time period. So that's not really the same as short-term holiday accommodation from the TOMS point of view. And actually this, they believe, would fall within the in-house supplies rather than a service for resale. So this is quite a technical point on the TOMS scheme, that you either buy in and sell straight out by just doing very minor alterations, or you buy in and then you provide it as an in-house service. So this is your accommodation now, which means you just must charge full VAT, compared to if you are buying it in, selling it out, and you charge the margin. So this was quite a critical point for them. The second point that they required, that services be supplied to travellers without significant modification or processing. Now, on the Sonders case, what they had actually kind of done was they'd leased the properties and they'd done some changes. Now, at the previous tier that we were talking about, they had said that the modifications that were done were minimal, which means that they were okay. There was no significant modifications. However, when it's gone to the upper tribunal, they have said that there was substantial changes, because they've brought furnishings in, they've adopted it for short-term use, which has transformed the nature of that property, and arguably that has disqualified them from the TOMS scheme. And the final point that they also raised was that they've basically converted what would be an exempt VAT supply. So residential property letting is normally exempt from VAT. However, they've transformed it from being an exempt supply into a standard rated, a taxable supply for VAT purposes, by transforming it into short-term accommodation. And this shift has indicated to them that the TOMS was not applicable, as the transactions did not align with the scheme's requirements. So this is quite crucial, that there's a couple of points here that they're raising to try and say, well, actually, what you're doing is not actually ticking those boxes for the criteria of the TOMS scheme. So this kind of means that the upper tier tribunal has looked at it and kind of gone, well, they're not just looking at the physical changes, they're also looking at the legal and the contractual changes that have been made to determine whether they fulfilled the criteria or not. So it's quite a kind of big position that they've looked at. They've not looked at just one small position or point. They've looked at the whole big picture and gone, well, actually, there's quite a lot of significant changes here. It's not just the physical. What are the contractual? What are the legal implications, to determine what the position is for the VAT points? From a contractual point of view, they've looked at what was included in that contract, and there's quite a fundamental difference between just taking on the property and reletting it out as short-term accommodation. But they've actually taken on quite a lot of rights, and a bundle of rights is how they've kind of termed it, that they're dealing with maintenance, they're dealing with utilities, they're dealing with water, council tax, furnishing the property, and all these sorts of additional expenses, all these different things that if they were just bringing it in and selling it out, they wouldn't have any of those responsibilities. And this is obviously different to what they're providing to the short-term let, because that short-term let doesn't have any of those requirements. Their just requirement is they're going to take care of the property while they're in it and leave. They're not going to have to deal with the maintenance. They're not having to deal with any of these other things. So it's kind of different in the contractual nature of what those two contracts are that are being provided. So what are the implications for our property businesses under the TOMS scheme? Now, this means that the alignment of services really has to be there. So the businesses must ensure that the services they acquire directly benefit the end traveller and align with the requirements of the TOMS scheme. So this is quite specific in nature of what needs to be provided. And next one, avoiding material alterations. Any significant modifications to acquired services, such as furnishing or reconfiguring properties, may disqualify them from TOMS. So this may even be painting a wall, it may be bringing in different furnishings, it may be putting things into the kitchen so it's all there. So it's whether actually you need a landlord to be doing that, or somehow managing that process so that it doesn't disqualify you, because you need the property to be fit and able to be done as instructed before you take it on, rather than you're putting in those changes. And the final is the caution with long-term leases. Companies using these long-term leases to provide the short-term may need to reassess their VAT treatment, as these arrangements might be considered in-house rather than eligible travel services. So as we said before, if you're buying in a 3-year lease and then you're letting it out for a weekend a week, that is quite different in terms of contractual services. And I appreciate there is difficulties in this because you need the long-term lease to know you can be doing this, but then in doing that you're negating the fact that you're changing the contract and it may disqualify you again for the TOMS scheme. So in terms of considerations we need to be making, if you are currently using the TOMS scheme, you may need to reassess whether this is the right approach for your business and whether you do actually fit the criteria and are eligible for using that scheme. If you are not eligible, you may need to have a look and see what the VAT implication is for making this change. If you are not using it yet but were considering using it, then I would suggest that maybe you want to hold off on making that decision till we see whether there's an appeal and what the response of the appeal is, as it may have far-reaching consequences that may find that it isn't allowable at any point, and if you go on to it and then have to revert to the other way, there may be some large VAT liabilities that you find become payable. The positives of this case is it has given us a lot more clearer guidance of what the different terminology means. So in terms of directly benefiting the traveller and in terms of what significant material changes are, they have been a lot more prescriptive, a lot more definitions and a lot more detail, which means it gives us more information to see whether someone would fit the criteria of the TOMS scheme or someone who would not, which is a positive for moving forward because it means that we can be a bit more definitive of whether or not someone can use the scheme or not. If you're using it, if you're thinking of using it, I definitely suggest you speak to your accountant to check how it fits together and what changes may or may not need to be made to ensure that you are complying with the regulations as case law has now determined based on this case's judgment in January 2025. If you're not eligible for the TOMS scheme, then you need to make sure you're charging VAT and you're claiming back VAT on any of your expenses. This needs to be using the standard approach to VAT and there is no margin scheme available for you. If you think you still are eligible for the TOMS scheme, make sure you check this out to make sure you're not doing anything wrong, and then you can continue doing as you have been doing. However, I would suggest you do an assessment to make sure that you're not creating any further problems for yourself going forward. As further developments happen on this case, I'll ensure we update you on the channel. And if there is any more questions you have on this topic, then please do leave a comment and we can explore any further aspects of it together in a future video. Hopefully today you've discovered exactly what is happening with the TOMS scheme and serviced accommodation and how that may impact your business. If you have any questions, then please do leave a comment. Please like the video and do subscribe to the channel. And let's make tax less taxing. Let's make tax less taxing.